Lauren Sunderland, first year Master's Public Policy student, and worked at an organization funded by my prior life. Which one was that? Washington Tennis Education College.
Hi, I'm Jillian Grissom. I'm a first year Master's in Public Policy student.
I'm Megan Golden. I'm a second year MBA student at Berkeley, and I used to be with the Virginia Tech. I'm a second year MBA and exchange student.
I'm Naomi Kelly. I'm a senior undergrad public policy major.
I'm Allie King. I'm a second year law student. I'm Liz Friedman. I'm a senior public policy student.
I'm Kimberly Jenkins, and this is my second day as senior advisor to the president and provost for innovation and entrepreneurship.
Oh, good.
Chosen to be with us.
I'm Catherine Burnett. I'm with the King Charitable Trust in China.
I'm Nancy Bernstein. I'm with Roob Notice and
I'm Robin Furman. I'm with Triangle Community Foundation, and I manage, in addition to many other things, our youth development grant making.
Eileen Wilhelm. I'm a philanthropic consultant.
I'm Robert Murphy. I'm the director at the Center for Child and Family Health.
I'm Carol Lincoln. I'm with a new nonprofit organization called Achieving the Dream. We work with community colleges.
I'm Kay Stratton. I'm with MDC and Public-Private Ventures.
I'm Patrick Sable. I'm a second-year public policy graduate student here at Sanford, and I'm also Joel Fleischman's research and teaching assistant.
And I'm Tim Walter, formerly ran the Association for Small Foundations, and an 85 PPS grad, and beginning some work with Ed Skloot at the Center.
I'm Greg Dees. I teach at the Fuqua School of Business and the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship.
Founder of it, actually.
I'm Kathy Clark, and I also teach at CASE at Fuqua School of Business.
I'm Joel Huber at Business School.
I'm Joel Fleischman at Stanford School. And that's it. Is that Mary coming? Yes, it's Mary. Time to introduce yourself, Mary.
Mary Kessel, Cecil Reynolds Foundation.
Good morning.
I'm Marty Martin. I'm an attorney in private practice representing tax-exempt and nonprofit organizations.
I can't see Susan.
Sarah.
Oh, it's Sarah. Okay, great. Okay, welcome everybody. Chase Alvieri. This is sort of my bank of students.
Public policy student.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Chase. Welcome. So today we are going to have sort of an interview between Nancy and myself. And a few more guests coming in. Yes? Anthony, you have to introduce yourself.
Yep. I'm Anthony So with the Program for Technology Access here at San Francisco.
And Paul?
And I'm Paul Bloom from the Fuqua School, Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship.
Right. Okay, most interesting and mixed, wonderful turnout. Nancy runs the Edna McConnell Park Foundation, which is about an $800 million foundation based in New York City. And hopefully,
Never know these days.
Yes, you're right, Joe. It's $900 million.
She just told me 5 minutes ago. That's the
no, I figured.
Market closed 10 minutes ago. You're good.
But it was 800 just last minute.
And EMCF, or however we may call it, the foundation, is one of the most important and innovative foundations in the country for a variety of reasons. Many of them having to do with Nancy's presence there. Many of them having to do with the programs that they have begun, carried forth, and work that they intend to do. And I think of all the people who have come this semester, certainly, and since I've been here, I would say that Nancy and the foundation are really very much at the edge of a large number of important initiatives that we'll hear something about over time. So I guess I'd like you to get a minute to introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about your background with the EMCF.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to have the opportunity to meet all of you. It is a really diverse group of folks, so I'm interested to be in a conversation with all of you. So thank you. I been at Edna McConnell Park Foundation for, I was saying to Joel just a little while ago, 16 years, which seems amazing to me because I've been in 5 different roles in that time, and it really feels like it has gone by as if it was just only a couple of years. Prior to coming to Edna McConnell Park Foundation, my background is really in community development, community organizing, and early childhood education. And I never meant to end up with a significant portion of my career being in philanthropy. In fact, it probably was something that I didn't think I wanted to do. And I was never really driven by a desire to be a philanthropist. I've always been driven by a desire to do work in low-income communities, to really make a difference in the lives of low-income kids in particular, and all of my career choices along the way have been with that mission front and center for me. I ended up at Edna McConnell Clark a little bit by accident. I had been working in Boston, and in the community development world, I ended up working for a project that was housed at the Boston Foundation, a project that was called the Boston Persistent Poverty Project. It was, for those of you that have followed these community building projects over the last 20 years, really, it was one of the first community building projects in the country that had been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in 6 different cities. This was under Jim Gibson, for any of the folks that may remember this work. And I ended up working on this project that was housed at the Boston Foundation that was considered quite innovative in the country, and was actually recruited by the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation to come and work in what became the New York Neighborhoods program. I started there as an associate, and 3 months later, the person that hired me, who was a new director there, ended up leaving, and Peter Bell, who was the president at the time, called me into his office on a Sunday and said, I'm making you the acting director, which was somewhat shocking, given where I was in my own career trajectory, and given what many things I didn't feel that I knew enough about to actually be able to do that job. And it was really through the work that we did in, let me just say, 2 years after I was hired into that role, my predecessor, Michael Balin, joined the Clark Foundation, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but we went through a really major transformation. In the first 4 years of his time as president, the place at the Clark Foundation, the program area where we were able to really experiment with some of the new methods of the grant making that's now the core of our strategy, was in the context of the New York Neighborhoods work. And I guess probably the thing that has driven me consistently in my early work in community development and with the Boston Persistent Poverty Project, and then in my even the New York Neighborhoods community grant making work, has really been an interest in organizational change, in the roles that leaders play in making change at an organizational level, and what does it actually take to do that well, and how are those elements sort of fundamental in actually making a difference in the lives of low-income kids at a significant enough scale to actually make a difference in some of our more intractable problems. So I guess that would be my introduction to myself. I have just on a personal level, I have an interesting personal life as well. I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. So that's the 2-year-old son is a bit of a miracle that sort of popped up in the middle of my last 5 years as CEO of the foundation, and is really a blessing and really inspiration for me in terms of my work.
Great. So you've managed many things in this role. I want you to, if you don't mind, to take a moment and talk a bit about what foundation giving and living was like at the time that Mike, your predecessor, Michael Balin, and yourself were there, in terms of how Edna McConnell Clark operated, and how much it was or wasn't like other foundations. But what was this animal like when you and he were there? First of all.
Well, I mean, I should just say that, it is essentially, the Clark Foundation, at the point that I joined and then Mike joined, was predominantly focused on trying to reform public systems, like many national foundations across the country. And the way that we went about doing our grant making was essentially to take the money that we were giving away on an annual basis and divide it among different program areas, and then hire really smart, I mean, in some cases brilliant, experts in particular fields, whether it was child welfare or education or criminal justice, and have them essentially determine what type of systems change initiative the foundation would run, and then essentially make project-based grants to whether it was government entities or organizations or collaborations and institutions to basically carry out the foundation's initiative, with the goal of really trying to drive public systems change. I do think Clark had some features that were very, very different than many of the other national foundations, even at that time. However, I would say the way I just characterized the grant making is very consistent with the way many national foundations operated then and still continue to operate, which is the notion that you carve out, the particular social problem that you want to work on, you run an initiative to try to actually produce outcomes around that social problem, and you provide project-based money to organizations to help you carry out those particular initiatives.
And so your choice and his choice, Mike's choice and then yours, was to change the rules of the game, both inside and outside. And that's a most interesting, I think, account of a foundation transformation that was willingly done. Would you take a few minutes to talk about that?
I guess I would just start with, it was really the board that was interested in change, in the sense that they made a decision to hire Mike, who brought a very different vision into the foundation. And I think on our board's mind was concern about whether with our limited resources we could really make a difference in reforming public school systems or reforming child welfare practice. Some of the issues we had been tackling for several decades, it wasn't clear that we were getting the kinds of results that perhaps our trustees wanted to see, or that it was that many of the initiatives we were running were really subject to external variables that were really not in our control. So, hundreds of millions of dollars spent with constantly changing school superintendents and principals and child welfare commissioners, and not necessarily feeling like we were getting the results. It really started with the board asking the question about is there another way? How might we think differently about working on similar social problems, but perhaps with a different methodology or a different way of getting results? And I would say that the Clarks in particular, and many of our other board members, were very attracted to working with direct service organizations. They really wanted to have confidence that the actual dollars that were being spent by the foundation were really making a difference in the lives of low-income people. And I think over time, as we got more and more involved in these complex systems reform strategies, we were funding more and more intermediary entities that were more and more removed, and that was something that they weren't comfortable with. So there was kind of a human element in addition to wanting to be able to see the measurable returns.
So they were asking for measurements themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they would have defined it in the same way that someone like Mike Fallon, who came from a research and evaluation background, would have defined it then and the way we define it today. But they wanted to actually be able to show up at a board meeting and be able to look at, over 10 years, these were the kinds of results we're getting. And they weren't able to see that. But then I think also they wanted to be able to actually go on a site visit and see some kids. So it was kind of it's an important thing to keep in mind, because I think for donors that really matters, to have the human experience as well, and so that was missing too.
So you took action. You reorganized how the grant areas, as they were configured, were done, and just push a little further on that. So
Okay. Well, it wasn't exact. So basically, I think there were a couple of. I think in the first, let's just say 4 years of Mike's tenure, and this was when I was just starting to run the New York Neighborhoods program. There was a big effort to try to integrate thinking about evaluation and measurement into the existing program areas, and to try to do more work with actually building of institutions. So I think Mike brought a philosophy into the foundation which said evaluation is really important, we've got to be able to measure things, and ultimately we really care about scale. This was something that the foundation always cared about. And we care about really getting things that work to scale. And so that requires investing in institutions too as part of the equation. So there was an effort to try to integrate, work around, I'm simplifying this, it was actually quite messy at the time, but essentially trying to integrate thinking about evaluation and thinking about organization building into the existing program areas. That was really, really hard to do because it essentially rubbed against the culture of the place. It challenged the very senior leaders who were the program directors, who worked very autonomously and were truly experts in their content areas. So it was really difficult to try to integrate the change ideas that he had through the existing structure. So what we ended up doing was basically carving out, and this was 4 years later, we ended up carving out a kind of a new program area at the foundation to basically experiment with creating a different grant-making methodology and apply it in the context of youth development. And it was from there really that we experimented with what is now our current full strategy, but it started really as a pilot project that we ran on the side.
Right. And could you describe what you're doing now? Because that takes us to the present.
Okay. So basically, the shift that we made was, first of all, moving from 5 different program areas. So we're giving $25 million away around 5 different issue areas, everything as diverse as community development in New York City to prevention of trachoma, which is a leading disease, a leading cause of eye blindness in the developing world. So basically, across 5 different program areas, we evolved from that to focusing around one set of outcomes. And we went through a whole process of selecting which outcomes those would be with the board, but essentially made a decision to focus on youth ages 9 through 25, avoidance of behaviors that would lead to negative outcomes, and achievement of education, achievement of employment as our focus, as our outcome areas. And then we essentially changed the grant-making methodology itself so that it was not focused on changing systems, but in fact, how do we find organizations that themselves are really making a measurable difference already in the lives of kids in these age range around these outcomes that have proof points, that have evaluations that they've already conducted, that are trying to grow, to actually serve significantly larger numbers of youth. And so essentially we moved out of what I call kind of the idea generation business, so hire really smart people to figure out what to do in a particular social area, to being in the business of trying to find the folks out there in the country that are the experts, that know what they're doing, that in fact have a track record of making a difference, and then looking at how to be a great investor in funding them and their organizations to basically grow and build the capacity to be able to serve significantly larger numbers of kids.
It's worth noting, actually, this is a very different model from what most foundations deal with. The way in which they give away their money and their aims. In a sense, moving from project support to institution support, but helping institutions grow. Typically, foundations like to start new things. They don't necessarily like to help the things that have already proved successful go to the next level of scale, which is exactly what this is all about, and is why it's such an extraordinary innovation that's being demonstrated now for the whole field of philanthropy.
I think the other, just to build on that, the other really major shift is to put yourselves in the minds of a nonprofit organization who's trying to raise money. So typically the experience of a nonprofit organization that's trying to raise money is they're trying to figure out, well, how do I fit myself into all of these different constraints that are presented to me by the philanthropic world, by government. What we did was try to turn that on its head and say, we're about you. We want to understand what you, the organization, need, and how do we actually provide you not only with, essentially what's general operating support to do what you need to do, but how do we actually package this in a way where you actually have the money that you need over a multi-year basis, up front, all of it in hand, so that you can execute on your growth plans without having to chase the money at the same time. So, it's a radically different way of receiving money if you're a nonprofit organization.
I remember in my early years in philanthropy, and it still is not uncommon today, where if you were very successful as a nonprofit, a foundation would see that as reason to take its money away. So, hey, you're great. I mean, you've succeeded, so we're taking a walk. So whether you failed, quote, quote, you could lose. Whether you succeeded, quote, quote, you could lose. Whether you're somewhere in between, you could win or lose. And so the standards are very pliable. And Edna McConnell Clark took a deliberate approach to rethink and rework how it would do its funding and its engagement. And just 1 second, I'd like you to do one more step, if you would, because there's also something in here about working more closely with grantees and engaging them more clearly about what they want and what you want. A new or a different kind of engagement and working together. How'd you do that? And how do you do it?
It's a really good question. If you looked at the engagement that we had with grantees 15 years ago and you looked at it today, it would actually look similar in terms of the amount of interaction and engagement. We were a very engaged grant maker in the old model as well. I think the fundamental difference is that what we're engaging grantees around is their business plan, their achievement of their performance metrics, their board development, their strategy. They're owning what the agenda is essentially that we are trying to add value around, and we can actually only add value if we are truly in a trusted relationship with the grantee, which is actually very, very difficult to achieve. I mean, even still today, it is one of our largest topics of conversation is, are we really in an honest dialogue with what's happening with the grantee organization or not? Because the entire the entire system, if you will, is about creating lack of incentive for nonprofits to tell funders the truth for the reasons I was talking about earlier, which is because if you tell the truth and it doesn't fit in the box, then you don't get funded. So it's a system that's based on lack of incentive to really speak the truth. And so it's a real challenge to actually be in an honest dialogue with a nonprofit about what their real needs are and where you can add value as an investor. So we try to get at that by when we first of all, we don't take proposals, with the exception of the fact that we are now currently, as some of you know, running a national competition for the first time in the last 10 years. So there's a great learning opportunity for us to see how we adapt the approach now that we're working with the Social Innovation Fund, which I'm happy to talk about. But for the most part, we don't accept proposals, and the reason for that is because we are interested in understanding who organizations are through a extensive due diligence process that we take organizations through, rather than through proposal writing, where organizations essentially tell you who they think you want them to be based on what you ask them to describe to you in proposals, which is typically what happens most of the time, I think, for most nonprofits. And so through this due diligence process, we go on site to organizations. We have a team that is really trying to understand the back office capability, the strengths and weaknesses of the leadership team, the board, etc. And then we produce an analysis. And we've actually, I think, gotten quite good at this over the last 10 years. So we have organizations that we end up declining out of due diligence who write us very extensive letters about how significant the analysis was in their lives. And we really try to add value back through this analysis. But through it, I mean, if it's done well, like every one of our organizations, there are imperfections. There are things to work on. And so we're interested in those things because we're interested in helping those grantee organizations reach larger numbers of kids. And sometimes it's about addressing the weaknesses in your leadership team or addressing the opportunities for growing your board that are going to get you to the next level. We have to be able to talk about those things. We try to start off the relationship through this due diligence process, trying to be in this transparent conversation. And then we help organizations put together business plans. We work in partnership with the Bridgespan group that many of you know to help grantees develop the business plans. And it's through the business planning process that a lot of these conversations happen about capability and capacity. And so then by the time we get to the end of all of that, we've begun to establish the basis for trying to be in a more open and constructive relationship.
You might also say something about the fact that the whole process that you use is based on agreed upon metrics of performance, so that you're starting at the very beginning, the process of renewing support, achieving objectives that are mutually agreed upon by you all and the grantee, so that everybody, you just elaborate that a little bit.
So the business plan ends up producing, as Joel is saying, a set of performance metrics that the grantees' boards essentially own and sign off on. So the management team is reporting to the board on the performance metrics that we are also holding the organization accountable for. So it really creates a system of great accountability because it's the grantees' performance metrics. They're not imposed on them by the foundation, so they really own them. And it's through the conversation about are the metrics being achieved or not that we are really continuing to build the open, honest dialogue, and we're also, of course, structuring our payments against performance. So we make a multi-year investment against, typically they're on average 3 or 4 years against a 3 to 5 year business plan. And our payouts are on an annual basis based on the achievement of performance metrics. And the performance metrics are reset annually as well.
So give a case, I assume there have been more than one where something has gone haywire. Where the agreement looked like it was going to go well. Maybe the executive director leaves or quits. Maybe something else. Have there been several or a few cases where something really unexpected happened, and how you put it back together again?
It's interesting. The majority of the problems that we've had have more to do with communication than they actually have to do with a major miss like the one that you're describing. So it's really interesting. And a lot of it has to do with what I'm describing, which is the real challenge about being in this trusted relationship. So one of my favorite stories, which all the parties are comfortable with me sharing, because it really was one of the most eye-opening experiences for me, was we had what we call a closing at the end of, at the point that you all know this story? We have a closing where at the point that our board approves our investment in the grantee, we then go through a process of setting terms and conditions, and then we have an actual formal closing with the grantee's board. And I typically, at least I was until maybe a year or two ago, now somebody else, now the vice president is doing this, but would show up for the closing with what we call the portfolio manager, which is our really lead senior person that did the due diligence and is managing the relationship and structured the investment. So we had actually the largest investment that we made in a grantee organization, and I went to show up for the closing. It was a very complicated grantee. It took us a long time to get to this deal, but one that we were very, very proud of. And I got to the closing. It's one of my favorite stories. And there was a dinner the night before the board meeting. And they had gone through, this was an organization that had spun out from a university setting with a board that was predominantly academically based, and had built a relatively new board with a group of CEO-level entrepreneurs from the private sector who were purposely brought on to really try to help capitalize this organization better and help it to go to the next level. But it was still challenged with some cultural issues from still being partially academic and then having this kind of new blood in the mix. So at the dinner the night before the board meeting, I was seated at a table with a group of board members, and one board member showed up kind of late to the dinner. And he's talking, and he doesn't realize who I am, and he wasn't that interested in finding out, I guess, who was at the table. And he turned to the other board member and to another board member and said, I just cannot get over the arrogance of this Clark Foundation with these terms. You know, who do they think they are? And it was an incredible moment because, you know, of course, I'm at the table. There's no one. They left me there. You know, I was alone, which is a good. Like it's a joke now. The foundation never send me alone to a dinner and the grantees, for the grantee board. But so it ended up opening up this dialogue that really we were not ready to actually do the closing with this organization because the board was not aligned around the performance metrics. It was just a classic case where they might have gone into that board meeting and said yes, 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 when they actually were not owning what they were signing up for. So we ended up having to caucus with the portfolio manager and the CEO of the foundation, and I sort of took the position that I really just didn't, you know, I thought it was an opportunity to get on the same page and it was okay not to go forward. We ended up not closing that next day. And it led to a really important process that our portfolio manager and his team had to go through with the grantee organization and our consultants to kind of reflect on the fact that we had missed steps along the way, that there wasn't the level of ownership that was needed over the plan, and that people were jumping over steps because they were eager for us to make the grant. And so I like to use that example because I hope you're following this, but it is this is where most of the things go wrong, is at the level of communication and actually how one as a grant maker does their work, and in a sense the care that needs to go into getting it right at the level of ensuring that grantees own the decisions that they sign up for.
What steps have you taken to decrease the likelihood of that misunderstanding with the subsequent grantees?
I mean, you know, that it's really about the critical variable in our success are our portfolio managers, which are the staff that we hire to run these relationships. And we've made plenty of mistakes in that area with hiring the wrong people or not taking the time that we need to develop them. And I think the major area of improvement has been getting much better at who we put into those jobs. And then we do have a very rigorous quality control function. So even we have very, very senior people that run these relationships, but we have a process that everybody in the organization goes through, a team review process where at every step along our decision-making process, you get kind of a peer review. And it's often through the peer review, and I participate in those, that these kinds of issues tend to come up.
And what was your reaction to the bad when he said that?
To me, it was kind of a blessing, because the worst thing we could have done was, as I mentioned, it was the largest deal at that time. We've done bigger ones since then, but we were closing on an $8 million grant over 3 years, and it would have been unfortunate to have had closed on that with the board not fully aligned. And I think even more importantly, it's a board, and it's still a challenging board, that really needed help about getting on the same page and also figuring out what its relationship was to its CEO. And so it really gave us a window into pushing that harder. And I think it in some sense gave the CEO some leverage with his board, because he was able to hold out, well, until we get this together, we can't close on the grant, so it accelerated a set of things.
It really, and again, so different. I mean, typically foundation staff members, even heads, don't meet with the boards of the grantees. They meet with the heads of the grant. It's the CEO of the grantee organization who really does all the discussions with them. Occasionally, foundations require the board chair to come involved, but typically you don't get that kind of direct interaction with the whole board that she's just described. It's very unusual.
We don't take a board seat. There are some venture philanthropy firms that do. We actually considered it and we decided not to. However, what's interesting is we are invited to all our grants. We're invited to the board meetings. We put it in our terms that we kind of have the right to come to them upon request, and we typically request to go to all of them, but we don't actually have to, because the portfolio managers in most cases actually add so much value in the discussion that folks want them there. But really it's important, because the only way to really understand what is actually going on in a nonprofit organization is to be able to go and experience the exchange between the CEO of the nonprofit and the board. That's how you get your best assessment of what is actually happening. And so to miss that opportunity, in our case, given the size of the investments that we're making, would be really missing a really significant piece of data that you can't get through a written report.
As you folks know, we're going to open this up for some Q&A, so start to think of the things that are most on your minds. Tim, you had a question, and I'll come back with one that you could have.
Yeah, I just think something to be helpful to this, to the folks in the room, Nancy, just to take to ground actually some of the activity and how the foundation does its decision-making process. And I didn't look at it. I haven't looked at the foundation for 4 years now, so you can update me. But this used to be a process where you had an applicant had multiple steps, and along the way, you were given a grant of a bridge fan group, I guess, that would do some really deep analysis, and this analysis was worth, I don't know, the word on the street was about $250,000. And so this is how intensive the foundation was, really looking under the hood of the grantees, and then finally through this, that's that learning process that you were getting the thank you notes from, that I think it's interesting for folks to hear the due diligence that went into the decision-making process, and then there's the multi-year investment, and leading to really a tremendous brand-building stamp of approval from the foundation that's signaled to other donors. They've been through this, and boy, we really get behind them and believe in them. Am I right? Is that useful?
Are you suggesting it would be helpful for me to walk through the court process?
Well, no, I was just thinking, you this has been fairly theoretical thus far, and I was just thinking that, like some of us who've been in the field, we understand when you say you do a lot of due diligence and the staff are important, but I think it's useful for them to hear, too, that the grantees really are going through this deeply, deeply intensive review that is useful, but that itself is also unusual for a foundation to spend that much time analyzing a potential grantee or investment. Is that right? Is that still what you do?
Yeah, no, that's our core selection process. So we have a team called our sourcing team that's constantly looking across the country for potential organizations that we're interested in taking through due diligence. We then take them through this due diligence process, which I described kind of high level. I'm happy to provide more details if folks want. We then we are looking to make our investments against business plans that have performance metrics. When we started this work 10 years ago, that was a foreign concept. There were very few nonprofit organizations that have business plans with performance metrics. That's evolved a bit. So now we will sometimes be doing due diligence on an organization that already has a business plan that we didn't necessarily help them develop. But if their business plan needs to be updated, or we don't think it's strong enough, or they don't have one, we will work with the Bridgespan Group to help them build one. And we will make an initial grant for business planning, which now is more than $250,000 usually. We did find in the early days we were making just these pure grants for business planning, and we found that organizations could move faster if sometimes we would add to the business, the initial grant, perhaps some additional capacity building support for a couple of key things that would be important in order to get their business plans done. So for example, sometimes we were helping organizations develop business plans, and they would get to the end and they'd have to hire 3 key people on their leadership team to even implement them, and then you would lose a year. So we now are trying to front load more of that, and I think it's because the analysis is better. So there's variation there, but the basic principle is, you need the business plan for us to make the longer investment, and then we are making a multi-year investment against the business plan. We also have added an additional dimension to the work, which maybe I'll talk a little bit about, which is our working capital aggregation, which we've piloted over the last couple of years. So, should I talk about that?
Yeah, take a moment.
Okay.
Just at some point, it struck me from knowing you and the work of the foundation, there was a realization that you couldn't go in one by one, group by group, whatever it may be, putting money out annually in chunks. It wasn't taking you precisely to the place you thought you wanted to go. And so there would have been some strategic rethinking and then a decision. So this happened 4 years ago, give or take. And it would be great if you would mention what you did and why and how it happened.
So when we started this work, so going back now, 9 to 10 years ago, really we believed that if we helped organizations develop these business plans and they had really compelling performance metrics, and we invested a significant sum of money against the growth plan, that other funders would join and help to fund these business plans. And the principle was help the grantee raise all the money that they need for growth up front so that they can focus on growth and not have to be worried about raising the money at the same time that they're worried about execution. So, for anyone who's run a nonprofit organization, that's like a dream come true to be able to do that. And so what we're interested in is better services to more kids. How can we get there faster? We felt like we wanted to try to solve that problem for nonprofits. That is really the driving operating principle around our whole grant-making methodology. So what we found 5 years into it was that it wasn't happening in the way that we thought it was going to. So grantees were able mostly to raise the money that they needed, but not up front. And what we were seeing was time lags in execution as a result. And we had a couple of exceptions to this. So one notable exception is the Harlem Children's Zone, which many of you may be familiar with, which was one of the first organizations we started this work with. And they are a notable exception because in their first business plan, we partnered with one of their key board members and 2 other foundations, and they had all the money that they needed against their first 5-year plan up front by the end of year 1. And people attribute their incredible success to Jeffrey Canada, that it's all about him. It's not only, he's a huge variable, but what it meant to have all the money that he needed to execute that growth plan in year 1 is a huge part of the story. So that was a very notable exception. And so we basically said, and this was really actually the year when I moved into the CEO role, and I remember having this conversation with the board saying, if we can't actually do something different on this capitalization strategy, I thought that the whole investment strategy was at risk. And so we needed to really figure out what we could do differently. So we piloted an effort over the last few years with a couple of key grantees in our portfolio who were had the evidence of effectiveness and were really ready to fully embark on growth, we did a piece of work to strengthen their business plans so that you could better show an investor how an infusion of upfront growth capital at the start of that plan would lead to longer-term financial sustainability. Not forever and ever, but that at the end of that growth plan, if you stopped, you could sustain the organization at that level. Essentially, you could replace the growth capital with other kinds of revenue streams. Not one model, very individualized per grantee. And so we then set out to try to actually do something different, which was at the point that we made, well, first of all, we made the decision to essentially triple the size of our investments in those organizations. So we were already doing investments that were averaging $5 billion. We averaged them, 15 million. Okay, and so we tripled what we were doing, and then we basically made the decision that in partnership with the grantee, we would go out and we would try to raise all the money that was needed for them to complete fulfilling the growth capital campaign goal that they have before we said go. So we weren't going to close on the investment. Our 15 million, let's just say it was different for 3 grantees, but let's just say average, wasn't a done deal unless we could raise the rest of the money. And we frankly surprised ourselves that we were able to do it. So we raised, it was $120 million across 3 grantee organizations. We actually raised the money in 9.5 months, which was, almost a year ahead of schedule. It was a shock. It was shocking. Fortunately, it was before the downturn. We would not have been able to do that the same way, I believe, if it had been 2 years later. And we, since then, have really been able to demonstrate the value of what difference it's made to have this aggregated growth capital in the hands of these 3 organizations. We basically have run what's essentially a syndication with the group of investors. We have 23 co-investors across what are really 3 different deals. And the money flows from the investor to the grantee. It's not a pass-through through us. It's not a fund. And what we do is we essentially hold all the terms and conditions. So all the investors sign the same terms and conditions, the same reporting, investments, and the same business plans. And then we run a quarterly co-investors meeting where the grantees and the investors come together and review the grantees' performance. And we've been evaluating this. We're about to actually come out with a report on some of the lessons learned. It's been extremely valuable for the grantees and for the majority of the investors. And this was really, we treated this as a pilot. We talked about it publicly as a pilot. We talked to our board about it as a pilot with the grantees to see, could this be done? And so now we're at a place where we're seeing that it can be done, and we're looking at how do we integrate this as more of a way that we do our business at the Clark Foundation, so that for that set of organizations that is what we consider to be growth ready, we would in fact try to look for ways to aggregate capital to help them basically get what they need up front. I think we've now convinced ourselves that it's hard to imagine going back to making our grants without having this other piece in place, because the chance of success is just so much greater.
That too is so rare in the foundation world, as I want to say, to be unique. I mean, it just is. It is the idea of one foundation taking the lead and putting together a deal package like that, and getting 23. How many did you say? 23 other funding sources to put up money to it. I don't know of another example like that.
Are the 23 all private foundations?
No.
Or?
No, it's a diverse group. It's a mix of national foundations, some local and regional foundations, some family offices, and a couple of individuals. It's quite diverse, and it was purposefully diverse. I mean, it was purposefully and accidentally. It was what we wished for, but it kind of, frankly, just happened that way. We were lucky.
Why do you think it happened so fast? What barriers did you encounter, or what barriers did you not encounter, did you say?
The reason why I think think it was successful has probably 90% to do with who the grantee organizations are that were part of this and how really terrific their business plans are.
You might say which ones they are.
And I would say, I will highlight the three of them are the Nurse Family Partnership, Youth Villages, and Citizen Schools. And Citizen Schools is a bit more early stage than Youth Villages and Nurse Family Partnership, and that was intentional on our part because we wanted a little bit of variation in the three types. So, but I think that the major reason why we were successful was because I think some of our peer organizations that have been trying to do this work create, in a sense, a bit of a barrier for the investor because, and let me just start this, and we were agnostic about how to raise the money. We thought, okay, if folks want to put their money in a fund, we'll do that. If folks want to give their money straight to the grantee, we'll do anything. We were willing to do almost anything. And we did not need to take any we were not charging the investors any money. So it was really this opportunity to, there are a lot of funders out there that are really interested in the questions about replication and scale and growth. And there are lots of funders that really want to make a difference for these kids, and there are not that many organizations out there that have these curriculums. So I think the opportunity to essentially know that you were getting in on a great deal, if you will, with the performance metrics that you could count on. And let me just add, we put in almost 30% of the $120 million. So
plus all the due diligence work.
All the due diligence, all the staffing. So we had a huge stake in it, so it minimized the risk. And then I'll just add, I mean, a lot of fundraising is about relationships. So there were folks that wanted to do this based on the relationships that they had with us and the grantees. I mean, there was nothing, in a sense, that magical about it, except that we had these really outstanding grantee organizations.
And you did all three at once as a package?
We did, yeah.
Why?
Well, because it's a good question. We wanted to package it because we felt that it would essentially be a more compelling opportunity for funders to be part of this. That and it was, we for ourselves organized this as a learning pilot for the foundation. I mean, just keep in mind for our board, this was taking on a really big risk in a sense. It was, in a sense, they were basically, our board was sort of agreeing that a significant part of my time, plus the time of a couple other senior people, was going to be spent doing fundraising. It's really radical for a foundation. So why, many boards would say, well, why should I have my CEO go out and fundraise? Their job is to give our money away. So, in a sense, it had to be packaged in a compelling way for our trustees to think this was worth it.
And to prove the point, the point is if they'd only done one organization, it wouldn't have proved the effectiveness of the method that they were using. By doing three at once, since you're not just helping one organization, you're doing that, but they're instrumental to proving the way you go about doing this.
Thank you, that's a better answer.
I think we mentioned at lunch, I might ask this question. Being aware of the success of this growth capital fund, raising a spectacular amount of money, $120 million over 10 months, and things going on well, would seem to indicate to a lot of other folks, hey, we ought to do this too. We ought to figure out a way and start our own collaborative, start our own venture capital pool, however it might be. And yet, since this really came out of the box about 3 years ago, we haven't seen many other funders be interested in the model, at least that's our take. How do you explain it? How do you explain the foundation lack of pickup?
I wish I had. Let me answer it in the context of just, it's not even so much about picking up our model, it's just in general.
Right.
looking for better ways to capitalize nonprofit organizations and to collaborate and pool money. And so I don't have, I mean, I can just share some reflections. I don't have an answer. But I'll say narrowly in our case, we set out to prove something to ourselves first. So we didn't set out to try to change the practice of other philanthropies. And, you know, maybe I wished that that might happen as a side effect, but that was not actually an explicit strategy. I think as we go to the next level of the work, it might be more of an explicit strategy to try to influence the context in which we're working a bit more than we have been able to date, because I think there is a lot of interest in our work because we actually have been able to prove that we can do it. And I think it's important because there's a lot of interest in evidence-based grant making and aggregating money to try to help better invest in what works. And this has been particularly fueled, I think, by the new administration, federal government, basically creating these different innovation funds and a lot of at least talk about trying to invest in what works and calling upon the private sector to step up and partner with government towards this end. And so there's been a big dialogue that has ensued as a result of this. But there's a disconnect between the dialogue and I think the desire of lots of philanthropists to try to do more and then practice. So what you see are these little pockets of things, but there's nothing systematic. And it is a concern because, for example, when we get ready to launch our next fund, we have to kind of start again. It's almost like starting from scratch. It's not as if there's something that has changed significantly in the sector to make that easier. Perhaps it will be easier with a set of investors that have some experience with us, but even they, remember, invested because of the grantee organizations, not necessarily because of the model. So I do see now there are some foundations that now are actually creating pots of money to work on capitalization or innovation, and that's new. So there are foundations that are putting resources aside for this. There are new evaluations that are happening in the sector. There will definitely be something around the Social Innovation Fund and the innovation funds with DOE that will encourage more of this. I do think there's a shift that's happening, and I think that the context is changing a bit. Certainly it's different than it was. It feels different to me than it was 4 or 5 years ago, but we still have quite a ways to go. On the other hand, I actually think it's something that could it could change very quickly, and suddenly all it would take would be 1 or 2 of the major national foundations and or a group of the new, even wealthier than before individuals to decide to work in this way, and it would be all of a sudden you'd start to see major ripples. I think and it could happen. It could happen really quickly.
Don't forget questions. Yes, Greg.
Yeah, so Nancy, you've described this as a pilot, and you've been successful in the sense of raising the money, but that obviously is not your goal. Your goal is to have impact and to help these organizations grow and achieve impact and ideally continue to raise money and continue to grow or generate funds on their own. So how are you going to decide when this is successful, if it was successful? Are they going to need another $120 million in 5 years? Are they not? Where's this going to stand? And if they need another $120 million, can that be provided? Are there another 5 organizations coming up behind them that are also going to need another $240 million or whatever it's going to be? And so how do you see this playing out over time as you think about what you would count as success if this really works?
I mean, it's actually really laid out on our website for anyone who wants to look at the details, but we really do have success indicators for each of these investments, and they were different. But the basic concept is at the end of the investment, that group of funders can exit because there are other funding streams that replace the growth capital. That we will actually achieve that with all 3
And the organization will
investment.
continue on a growth trajectory, or will they plateau?
Well, they would be, I mean, it's essentially they would be where they are. If they want to grow again, they need to raise more growth capital.
Okay, so
There's no
they,
question.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, if they want to continue to expand their impact
Right, there's no question.
in this country, they're going to continue. The growth capital challenge will still be facing.
Yeah,
So
although
they won't need additional subsidy for operating capital, but they'll continue to need growth capital.
right. But that's it's important to the distinction itself is a significant one though for as a nonprofit because it's a different way to raise money.
Yeah.
And for some of them, it really varies. For example, a nurse-family partnership, which is, I should just add, they're all about a year behind schedule because of the downturn. But even that, like we're doing a little study right now to benchmark how these organizations did compared to others who didn't have the growth capital during the downturn. Because I think one of our hypotheses is that they navigated better as a result of having had their resources. I mean, it's a no-brainer on some level. But I think, like, for example, for a nurse-family partnership, they really might not actually need to raise more growth capital, just given what their financial model looks like and what it took them to get to where they would now be with federal funding and an ongoing way to fund themselves. So that would ultimately be the goal, but every model is different.
Can I ask it from the other direction, which is you get an assessment from you about the capacity of the field itself, the capacity of community-based organizations to meet the standards to even qualify for the deals. Because they're not, at least in my experience, there are not a lot of nurse-family partnerships around, and the degree of fragility, particularly after what's happened in the last couple of years, must impact to some degree how you both assess the stability of an organization, but also its capacity not only to survive and grow on its own, but then to serve as as the basis for replication, getting to scale beyond the organization as it stands today.
It's a great question, and I haven't talked at all about our work with earlier stage organizations, but what you're describing is really what we think of as kind of a pipeline constraint. So there really isn't the robust pipeline that exists in the sector of organizations that are kind of preparing themselves for this kind of investment. And we as funders don't do a very good job preparing them at these earlier stages. So it's a great concern and something that we have been trying to work on over the last 10 years, but not really aggressively. However, we have recently made a decision to launch essentially a new venture to work with early stage organizations on this very question. So essentially, we actually are not good working with earlier stage organizations. The investment model that we built works really well with organizations that are in this kind of growth-ready segment. They have the evidence base or are really ready to build it. They have grown and they're really ready to grow. We're less effective with them, but probably not with any of their money to keep it independent, but to look at could we work with a cadre of earlier stage organizations in a different way, walled off from the rest of what we do in our grant making, to help them work on these organizational building questions, the fragility issues, and in particular evidence building at earlier stages in their life cycle. So how can we marry the right investment approach with the right technical assistance support? And then I think in general in the evaluation world in particular, it's just we don't have a systematic way to really help organizations that's cost effective. We've got research shops that can research you, but it's hard to get the support to figure out what's the performance measurement system I need to build for myself, and how can I do that on the cheap so it doesn't cost me an arm and a leg, and how can I collect my own outcomes and get myself ready to do evaluation later down the road. And so there's a real gap in the kind of infrastructure of the intermediaries, I think, in being able to deliver this support. So just like with BridgeSpan, we were one of BridgeSpan's early investors investors in a sense. That capacity to do business planning didn't exist in the way it exists today 10 years ago. I think we have a similar problem right now in evaluation support to nonprofit organizations.
And certainly performance measurement of any
Right.
kind.
Yeah.
Any kind.
Yeah. That's actually a better way to talk about it in terms of performance measurement.
So Nancy, before we go ahead, let's take it to the present. We now, in the last couple of years, have seen the Obama administration introduce 4 programs that, each of which it would seem to me have metrics and evidence-based activities built into them, and the expectation is such. The one that you're primarily involved in is the SIF, or Social Investment Fund, and that one is under essentially the structure of AmeriCorps or of CNC, Corporation of National Security, CNCS, so you know what it is. And then there's Race to the Top. They're all different, but the other 3 are the Department of Education. So that's kind of the background that we all can use as a platform. But so here we now have an administration, quite uncharacteristically, starting to talk about all those things and wanting to do that you kind of beat them to the punch 10 years earlier and began to work out the mechanics and how do you do it and how do you think about it. So in the last couple of years, what have you been doing with the federal government and alone to take the model and develop it further and advance it throughout the country?
I mean, I think the truth is we haven't really done very much proactively. I wish we had done more on some level, but we did get looked at by both the Social Innovation, in a sense they came to us, I would just say, so both the Social Innovation Fund architects and the folks that were putting together the I3 were very interested in our work because we are one of the few examples in the country of an evidence-based investor trying to scale things and invest in what works, which is really what these innovation funds are trying to do. So I think as they were developing their strategies, and keep in mind the individuals involved in this work are folks that in some sense came out of philanthropy, so they're our friends, so they know us on some level. I mean, maybe not friends, but they're people that know of our work. They were interested in learning from us. So for example, if you look at the evidence standards for the I3, those are almost a direct replication of our evidence standards. They don't credit us for them, which is, I mean, I'm not, I can't even be sure that they are direct. I know they looked at our work and I know it's similar. Same with the Social Innovation Fund. I mean, and certainly, a lot of this is driven by OMB. I mean, OMB is the driver on the evidence-based standards. So OMB has definitely spent time looking at our work. One of our main partners is MDRC, that is very connected with OMB, a resource to OMB. So I think that the folks who were involved in crafting these programs were very thoughtful in the beginning about trying to figure out what they could learn from. And there were many other organizations that they were looking at across the country as well.
But you have become an intermediary under the SIF program and building out from there.
Yeah, so we did make a very complex decision to apply to be one of the Social Innovation Fund intermediaries, and we actually won the competition, and we are the largest of the 11 intermediaries. We went through a pretty extensive decision-making process to decide to do this. The reason we decided to do it was because we felt that what the Social Innovation Fund stood for in its best sense, so biggest vision, if you kind of think about what its greatest potential is, which is to try to model and try to be a stimulator of a different way to align public and private investment in an aggregated way to fund things that work. It was hard to imagine not participating in that, given how aligned our strategy is with that. So we felt we would give it a shot with that high ambition in mind and try to see if we could deliver value. And by hopefully offering up a portfolio of investments with aggregated money attached to it that would be a demonstration of the way government and philanthropy can partner together to invest in scaling things that work. Whether that can be achieved or not is a really big question. I think that there are a lot of things that aren't in our control, like who the other 10 intermediaries are, who are extremely different from us. So it's not as if our model exists with 10 other similar models. It's a really diverse array of models. So we want to make sure we can kind of hold on to our brand, our set of standards on evidence, our experience in scaling things that really have proof points, and make sure that others can learn from that work, and that we can learn from the work of the other intermediaries, but we're kind of a little bit apples and oranges. So there's also a lot of value in that because there's a huge diversity of experience across the intermediaries, but there's some questions there. And then I think it's just really, I do have a fundamental question as to whether there's any role for the federal government in any of this work. Should there be more of a wall, really, between where federal investment makes sense and where philanthropic investment makes sense? So I have some real questions, fundamental questions about that to be sorted out. And I would say the start of this has not really been that much fun, meaning we knew it was going to be hard to work with the federal
That's
government.
That's not for quotation, right?
This is not a publicly recorded conversation. Well, it's fine. I don't mind. I'm happy to go on the record on that.
Sure.
On
YouTube.
It's been really challenging. So as just even the process of signing a cooperative agreement as a private foundation with the federal government, something that I'm not sure has actually happened. I keep looking for other examples of this. But certainly the corporation has never had this experience, that's for sure. And we certainly have never had the experience. And it is really, it is actually an innovation in and of itself, in government to be able to even conceive of doing this. But there's a very big disconnect between what I described as the really big opportunity and the vision of this, and then what actually happens on the ground in implementation and execution.
Just like being a grantee.
Oh, it is absolutely. It's absolutely, except that we treat our grantees in a more respectful way. But
the government officials really are arrogant.
I've been saying it was a very challenging summer for our team, and I've been saying exactly that, which is just so important in some sense to have the experience because it's so humbling. It's so humbling. I had my CFO sitting across the table from the corporation's lawyer, essentially with the corporation's lawyer saying to us, in 300,000 grants, no one has ever questioned our terms. And my CFO saying, but we're putting up 3 times the amount of money. This isn't just, and I thought this was a cooperative agreement. So it's really, we're keeping a great journal, an organizational journal on this because it is really, truly going to be a fascinating experience.
When are you planning to publish this?
Not this year. Not this year.
Yeah, Paul.
Is there anyone out there that has compared this process or thought about this process relative to other government processes like NIH, like National Science Foundation, and so on? Has anyone thought about that?
On the social innovation funds?
Yeah.
Well, clearly they did not think a lot about this in the start of this. I think they're now getting ready. They're now saying, as I think many probably folks here know, there was a lot of backlash against the Social Innovation Fund competition because it got benchmarked against the I3 competition, and it was deemed as not transparent enough, and then all this scrutiny got raised, and it was unfortunate. On the other hand, the corporation could have really handled it differently, and I think now they're looking at, so for year 2, how can we do this better? And now they're looking at all these different models that use a lot of variations on the selection process. Some use external reviewers, some don't. Some use staff, some, and my sense is that they really went from getting the legislation in place to, having a couple key people put these competitions in place, and they didn't have a lot of thought going in, again, to implementation. But now I think they're on it, and they're looking at some of those models, which is good, because there's a lot of experience out there that they can learn.
Joel? Nancy, this is very exciting, particularly the metaphor with investment in the regular company. So I want to talk to you about the notion of return. Typically, if I invest in a company, I put money in and I get money out. You've got a big problem because you're not getting money out. So how do you make those comparable? And it's important because if you want to say this is a better return than something else, you've got to somehow make those comparable. How do you work the accounting?
So, and this is all on our website as well, because we do try to put
I read this thing.
I wasn't saying that. I'm just saying because there's more detail. That's not to say you should have read it. It was just to say. We're looking at 3 dimensions. We're looking at first the actual evidence of effectiveness and what is the cost benefit of that. So ultimately, we want to actually be investing in organizations that can actually do cost-benefit analysis, because that's really the only way to get into the question.
Okay, so that gives money and money.
Right. But we're basically looking at 2, in addition to that, which is harder, we're looking at 2 sets of metrics. One is around growth itself, so numbers of kids, but counted in a particular way, which is more about the capacity to serve kids than it's actually just a turnstile number. And then second, we're looking at financial metrics, which is particularly revenue and net assets as an indicator of growth, because you're not actually able to do we're not able to do a pure SROI calculation on these investments, at least not yet, given the state of what the field is, because they're not good countermeasures.
Are you sure you want to in any of it?
Maybe not.
Many social goals are very resistant to
We've tried it. It's not conducive for the kinds of interventions for the most part that we're working with. But for example, for an organization like a Nurse Family Partnership or a Youth Villages, they have really compelling data on how the cost of serving a mom and her baby saves taxpayers, X amount of money on an annual basis, and saves, compared to the 6 other home visiting programs in the country. So that's the kind, we can get there on an individual level with grantees in the portfolio, but we're not able to do it across our whole portfolio because of the diversity of what we actually have in the portfolio.
Anthony?
Yes, this is very interesting. I was wondering, given the set of metrics we were just describing, as well as the focus on service and the mezzanine level of funding, I'm wondering what you see as the role of the support of advocacy, either by the Clark Foundation or by its partners, in reshaping the policy or funding environment for your so-called grantees.
It's funny, we just came off every year we have an annual retreat of all of our grantee organizations, and this was our 10th year anniversary of this strategy, and we did a reflection on where we've been, and then we did kind of a histories of the future of where might they all be and we be 10 years from now. And people were reminding me that at our retreat, 4 years ago, I was really resistant on the issue of us investing in advocacy around this work. And I'm much less so right now. And there's a reason for that, which is because we were really trying to, for at least the first part of this 10 years, and actually most of the 10 years really, let's just say the whole 10 years, trying to determine whether there's a there with what we were funding. Is there something that's worth really investing in a massive advocacy strategy around, or public policy strategy around. And I think certainly in the last 4 years, some of the key investments in our portfolio have been, our success is about our grantees' success. And I don't know how familiar you all are with organizations like the Harlem Children's Zone, like Nurse Family Partnership, and like in youth villages. But these organizations have had incredible success in the political world in the last 2 years, 3 years in particular, even with the downturn and everything else. They have invested in advocacy as part of their growth strategies, and we therefore have invested in them and those efforts. And they wouldn't be there if it wasn't for some of those investments. It's not, the conversation we were having at our retreat is it's not enough just to have the evidence base. If you're not also engaging in a political strategy, you're certainly not going to capture the attention of Congress, because Congress is not really interested fully in evidence-based investing, because we were talking about this earlier, if I have the choice of getting $1 million in my district or not getting $1 million in my district because somebody else in another district has an evidence-based model, I'm going to go for the $1 million in my district. So it's just not enough, And I think that's one of the big revelations right now about this work for all of us, is that, when I look ahead at the next 10 years, it's clear that for the set of organizations in our portfolio that we really believe deserve to truly be at scale in this country, whatever that means at scale, but to actually be able to reach enough kids to actually solve some of these really difficult problems, like the problems of youth transitioning out of foster care. Youth villages actually could crack that problem at a national level. There has to be a political strategy to go along with the it's not ours to run necessarily, but to look for ways that we can support an organization like Youth Villages to build it and to work on augmenting the investment strategy so that that's an integral part of what they're doing. I think we are much more open to that than we certainly were 10 years ago.
If I can follow, it sounds like in a sense you're coming back to system level criteria for success and trying to figure out how to complement your organizational strategy. Is that accurate, or is that a concern?
See, for me, it's funny, I didn't start here with this, but I feel for the Clark family, the driver for them has always, in a sense, been how can we really make the largest possible difference that we can for the largest numbers of people. I think any which way you go, you kind of end up somewhere around systems change on some level. It's just what's your pathway for getting there. And I think we're in a much safer and probably more effective zone as an investor. Again, because I think, to me, the biggest shift that we made was this: we're out of the idea-generating business, and we're in the investing business. And so even if we want to invest in youth villages to engage in a systems change strategy, we've got to invest in them to do it, which is different than us trying to somehow make that happen. And that's one of the problems of our whole sector, is that it's why we have the infrastructure issues in the sector, because compared to the private sector that predominantly invests in institutions and infrastructure, we're all about how can we get more for less all the time. How do we make sure that we're only funding this part of the program, not the operating support, not the overhead, and so, it's, in a sense, that's the fundamental challenge that we have. So even, I do think it is full circle, but that, to me, is completely aligned with who the Clarks are, and what we really stand for as an institution. On the other hand, the methodology of how we get there is entirely different. And I think we don't have the pure evaluation that would say it's better, but we can certainly say, we can point to more evidence that we're getting results. So,
proving, generating the evidence in the way in which you're doing it is a much better way of persuading people that it's something worth replicating. And that was the problem with the old. It's the problem with other foundations who are doing it today. You're basically doing it and showing and with generating performance measures that are, most people would say, are valid and the best available evidence of success. And so you're giving people a reason to believe in the worth of replicating that stuff. And that's always been the problem in the social sector.
The other thing we haven't talked about are timelines. So that was another big topic of conversation at our retreat, which is what really are the timelines that we're talking about. Ward and I have been talking about this as well. And everything in foundation land is 3 to 5 years. It's like, you know, if you just
match up with the tenure of most programs.
Right. But if you just scan right now, you took all the foundation, top 50 foundations in the country, and you looked at their websites and you looked at their strategies, like the majority of things would be 3 to 5 years. And even with us, I mean, when we started this work, if you looked at our first growth plan that we presented in 2000, our board, where we talked about rolling out from our pilot effort to the Youth Development Fund, it was we were going to make these 3 to 5 year grants, and we were going to get them organizations of sustainability, and we were going to be done. We really thought that. And we thought 10 years later we would have funded maybe 150 organizations. I mean, it's really silly. So the reality is 10 years. We've been funding Harlem Children's Zone for 16 years. Okay, that's and we just made another. It's not publicly announced yet, but we're actually helping them do a final aggregation, big time thing to get them to their next level of sustainability. And by the way, every major foundation that has funded them to date thinks they're done and is gone. We were done, but we're going back in to do this last round of growth capital because all the other foundations are leaving, to signal this is not the moment to walk away for this particular organization, with everyone in the country looking at them and the need to really to succeed. But anyway, I guess I'm lost my train of thought now. I'll come back to me.
Well,
sorry, timeline.
No,
timeline. Oh, timeline. Right. Yes. Okay. So it'll end up being a 20-year cycle with them, and I do think it's a 20-year cycle, and that's way longer than most foundations just will think. And by the way, we were in a 20-year cycle in our prior work too, so that's a credit in some part, in large part to, again, the Clarks and just the willingness to really get behind things over the long run is different.
What do the other foundations say? I'm sorry. What do the other foundations say when they say, well, we've done enough for getting out? What do they tell them about, well, you've lost interest in you because you're succeeding so much?
Well, it's this constant, it's like, we're done, we don't have any more room in our budget for you, we didn't plan for you, we've got our whole budget spoken for. It's that kind of conversation.
And that also goes back a long time, that kind of remark.
Well, is it a philosophical thing of, we think we want to do new things, or is it also a piece of what Greg was talking about, which is that as these organizations scale, they just need so much capital, right, that everyone can give a smaller and smaller piece before they start. I'm just wondering if there's kind of a math issue.
There is a fundamental, I'd be interested, Joel, and Greg, your thoughts on this, but in my mind, I think there's a fundamental psychological culture of the philanthropic and government funding world, which is about nonprofits should do more with less. It's just, if you look at the average grant size of the top 12 largest foundations in this country is $167,000 a year, something like that. So I might not have that exactly right, but it's really, and so there's the whole culture is about, we get you to a certain place and then you go on without us. And there's not a lot of deep looking at questions about financial sustainability, and most folks make very small bets on things. They don't make really large bets. The notion of fully capitalizing something is not normal.
Well, it's really philosophical. It's philosophical in the sense that most people in foundations who have spoken, people who I've interviewed, most people will say that the role of foundations is to start new things, not to provide support to things that somebody else has already started. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So that's why this is such a really interesting change from the way in which most foundations operate. They're saying, no, we're not going to invent something new. We're going to find some things that really are working that somebody else has done and help them get even better and reach a larger audience. But for most foundations, our role is to start something new. We'll do something for 3 years or 5 years and prove what can be done and let somebody else, they don't say who the somebody else is, let somebody else take it further.
I think, just to add to what you said, Joel, I think this is correct. If you go back to the beginnings of philanthropy, and you go back to Rockefeller and Carnegie and Julius Rosenwald, here you had examples of people who were really willing to make enormous bets and keep them going. You folks may know, I mean, Carnegie's 5,000 libraries in America and in Europe, and he ran this through over 25 to 30 years.
That's right.
You have Julius Rosenwald, who built over 5,000 schools in the American South that educated, up until World War I, a third of all the African Americans in America, in the South. Saw the issue, took the time, and he ultimately spent down, but that took a course of 30 years to do. So what strikes me interestingly, Nancy, is as we look at the culture of philanthropy, in the earliest years, the biggest players were not troubled by this issue. It strikes me. Only in more recent times, with answers I have no idea why, has this shortening of the time horizon really come upon us. And now it really is, it's most places.
I mean, I wonder about this, a question that Joel and I were talking about earlier about what the difference that it makes to have live donors essentially driving philanthropic activity. And I personally have a hypothesis that is a lot of the challenge because, for example, if you take a philanthropist like Stan Druckenmiller, who was the chair of the Harlem Children's Zone Board, who's been our major funding partner. He's a guy. He didn't want to sign up to on the Gates, top 40 philanthropists that are committed to spending down their lifetime. He didn't want to. That he is committed to that. He didn't want to do it publicly. He's a very behind-the-scenes kind of a guy. Probably wouldn't like me talking about him right now. But he's all about building the Harlem Children's Zone as an institution. So he believes if Bowdoin, another organization he's deeply committed to, can have an endowment of $1 billion, why can't it be that a Harlem Children's Zone, even though they're serving predominantly African American kids in Harlem, why can't they? That's what so he's driving a whole set of activities, his own personal investing, his friends, everything else in the same way that, and I wasn't around then, but I imagine Andrew Carnegie went about caring about the library. It's his passion, and he's not going to be done until the job's done. That's just really different than the way that what I would call the institutional foundations operate with paid staff that on some level are risk adverse. Right? So there's a culture that is very risk adverse. And if you actually look at you looked inside the biggest, not all, but most of the largest national foundations in this country that no longer have the donor engaged, they actually have very similar operating models. So they've kind of, it's not like any of them have invented a different operating model. They're all really similar. So I just feel that it's a question for me.
Yeah,
something to look back.
I think, I'm not sure that the real determinant is the existence of a living donor. I think it can cut both ways, actually, in the sense that what a living donor can do is to provide moral authority and stick-to-itiveness if he wants to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of the living donors don't, and they are much, they are very impatient, and they want they want to get on with something else. But the right ones who care about that can make it happen in a way that the absence of those donors can't get a foundation without a living donor to make that kind of a long-term commitment. So it really just depends. But there are people, you look at Ford, for example, which has stuck with organizations for 30 and 40 years, and they've done it. There's never, after Henry Ford II left the board in the early 70s. In fact, most of these things really occurred after he left the board. So so I think it's hard to generalize about it. There are just a number of different factors, and that's just one of them.
Let's do one more question, and then Nancy, if you'd like to wrap up and say anything more, we'd be happy to do it. So you're next.
I was going to ask if there are some lessons learned from your initial investment that you would be sharing, which I just did as information on the website. It's a two-part question, because then you have something, are foundations starting to replicate it? I know Growth Philanthropy Network is trying to do the mezzanine financing similar to what you're doing. So do you see any type of movement, even if it's small, to continue this? Because I applaud you. This is amazing. It really is.
Any lessons learned in general about the work?
From the investment, because you really put yourself out there to do it, and you took the lead, and you made your own investment, and then you worked with 23 different investors on it. So were there some interesting lessons learned from that?
Don't go alone.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest lessons that I feel that we're still learning, that I'm still learning, have to do with first around talent development. So it's been in the last 2 years predominantly, maybe 3, that I have really started investing with our board heavily in our own talent development at the foundation to be able to do this work well, really do it at a even higher level. And I think this is an area that it's not specific only to foundations, but just in general, that the nonprofit world most of our grantees don't attend to it as much as they need to. We're all underinvested in it, and foundations are too. And so that to me is something that I've been, it's always been important, but I've learned a lot more about how to do it better, and it's really, really fundamental to our success. The second is what Ed was just saying, which is about not going it alone. So right now, I think we have as a major operating principle in the next iteration of our work, because in a sense, we are ourselves in a growth mode right now. So with the combination of the Social Innovation Fund, where we are going to basically be doubling our payout, and also with this new venture that I mentioned earlier that we're launching with earlier stage organizations. We, in a sense, we're in a growth mode, and then plus trying to leverage the work that we've built to date and the capital aggregation work that's going to surround all of that work. The motto of not going it alone is huge. And we, I think, have done a really great job at building relationships over the last decade that allow us to be in the place where we think we can even take the risk to go to the next level of the work. But this is a relationship-driven business, and it's really, really important to not go it alone. And most foundations do go it alone. So figuring out how to not go it alone with partners that are used to going it alone is challenging. But it's pretty fundamental. And for example, with this new venture with the early stage organizations, our vision with that is we're open on the question of whether it even is branded as an Edna McConnell Clark Foundation thing or not. If it can better serve the sector and more funders by existing in some different way, we're open to that, which is a pretty significant departure from where we were 8 years ago. So I think that would be the second major lesson. And then I think the third area is this issue about politics, which I was talking about earlier, which is a more of an emergent lesson, but just recognizing that we're being naive if we think that just purely by helping build the evidence base of organizations and their capacity to grow and scale, that some magical thing is going to happen.
That argument, though, that's right about political support, but I do believe that one of the reasons that foundations have not collaborated in ways that you're beginning to get them to do is that the evidence hasn't been there, the solid performance measures were not there. What you're providing is to foundations that care about the same program areas that you care about, or population beneficiary target areas. You're giving them something that they can comfortably stand on. And that's not true because they're not worried about their constituencies the way congressmen are.
Let me just be clear about this, though. I am not suggesting that we stray from our really major commitment to evidence building. That is front and center for us, and we're not straying from that. It's not a suggestion that we're straying from that. It's just recognizing that for those grantee organizations that are really at the place where they can get to that sustainable funding strategy, they're going to have to do something more, and the more is going to be most likely in the political having a funding strategy. And we need to figure out how to be a smart investor around that. That doesn't mean we run the political strategy or we take on some new initiative, but how are we a smart investor in their political strategies?
I'm sure you'll figure out a way. You've been smart about everything else.
Nancy, any final words you have, or we certainly put you through the grinders?
I guess I would just say on a personal level that there's probably not been a day that I don't wake up excited about the challenges and the work, and really hopeful, knowing what many of our grantees have been able to accomplish with this kind of investment approach, and I think that's the motivator. So, for any of the folks around the room that are in the business or thinking about being in the business, it actually really matters to be able to I feel that we've been able to take the risks that we take organizationally because we're really motivated by trying to make a difference every day for the grantees, and that's an important part of the work. So.
Well,
thank
for
you so
all of
much
us, thank you for. Next, we have this semester one more visitor, Rip Rapson, who is the CEO of the Kresge Foundation based in Detroit, or right outside Detroit. Rip is a remarkable fellow, and I particularly want to commend another aspect of the philanthropic work we're talking about, very different from what Nancy's been talking about. Rip has essentially been, in part the same, pulling together a large number of Michigan-based foundations, of which Kresge is quite large, in order to rehabilitate and bring back to life Michigan, Detroit and Michigan both, and is deep into, not because he wants to, because Rip, you will see, is a retiring, soft-spoken fellow, deep into the politics of Detroit and Michigan in ways that I'm sure he wouldn't want to be, but it almost picks up with your son. At some point, you've got to play politics in order to get some stuff done. So I commend it to you. What's happening in and around Detroit now is a really remarkable story, and if you're lucky enough to come in a couple of weeks, you'll hear it. So thanks very much.
Thanks.